Don't expect the Chicago Bears to spend all $90+ million of their salary cap space this offseason. But under league rules, they do have to spend quite a bit of actual cash this year, and a lot of that could go to a couple of contract extensions to players already on the books.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. On the show today, we'll be joined by salary cap expert Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus. He's also a contributor to OverTheCap.com, and he's like the go-to guy not only for every team's salary cap news, but specifically the Chicago Bears. He's been a Chicago guy. He's been around this team. I believe he roots for the team. If not, he follows this team very, very closely, I think more so than others. So not only does he know the ins and outs of all the different salary cap rules, but he knows this team thoroughly and what's going on around this roster. So we're going to break down some of the different salary cap situations the Bears are dealing with this offseason, the difference between how much salary cap they have and how much money they have to spend under league rules, and why they may carry some salary cap space over into next year. And we'll look at potential contract extensions for Cole Kmet, Darnell Mooney, and Jaylon Johnson, how likely they might be and how that might fit into this Bears salary cap situation as they approach free agency, and whether or not they're going to spend big bucks on big name free agents or maybe spread it out among quite a few other players. There's a lot to get into with Brad. He's one of my favorite guests to have on the show. So let's jump right in. All right, so Brad, to get us started here, I want to try and set proper expectations for this offseason for the Bears. I mean, we know they have over $90 million in cap space. It's like $40 million more than the next closest team. So we have this idea, I think, that the Bears could just outbid anybody they want on any free agent. But do you think that means we'll see big swings on multiple top free agents, or does $94-ish million not go maybe as far as we might think?
Just because you can swing big doesn't mean you always have to. I think they will on a couple guys to a degree. If certain players maybe avoid a franchise tag, namely Daron Payne, someone that comes available that they maybe didn't think was going to be available, maybe they'll swing big there. But I do think for the most part, you'll get a couple big ones and then a lot of mid-tier signings to really round out this roster, right? It's not a roster that's one or two big pieces away. It's a roster that's a lot of pieces away. But yeah, if the opportunity presents itself, I think they will, be one of the bigger spenders in all of the NFL this offseason, and that could be on a couple big deals.
Do you see this as a spot where Ryan Poles, wow, I got to get that out of my system here, might try and, front load these, or at least not backload contracts as much as certainly Ryan Pace used to do? I mean, this was a team that was often pushing a lot of money as far into the future as possible to get really, really low year one cap hits to try and accumulate as much as possible. But, does a $94 million salary cap space give them more flexibility to load up more money in year one? Or is it still the smarter thing to do to push money into the future because presumably the salary cap is going to keep increasing every year?
I think they will, and I think they should. So, I mean, in a general sense, yes, it is smart with the salary cap always rising to push some out into the future, enable yourself to spend more, and, let those inflation of the cap kind of absorb some of those hits. But this year in particular for the Bears, with how much cash they need to spend and all the flexibility they have, especially if you're thinking about a potential second contract for Justin Fields and some other players we'll get into, why not eat up some of this current year cap space? A great example right now is the New York Jets, who had kind of a similar situation a couple years ago. And two players they signed, when Carl Lawson, the defensive end, and Corey Davis, the wide receiver. they had these very flat contracts with early, large cap hits. Now, if they wanted to move on from either guy, they'd have six figures in dead money. I mean, you're talking about Ryan Pace and the Bears, setting records with Khalil Mack for the most dead money for a non-quarterback ever. Things of that nature. That's not what you want to get into right now. One other good example, Jimmy Garoppolo goes to the 49ers. They give him like a $28 million roster bonus in the first year of his deal. All of that hit the first year cap, and it just gives you more flexibility down the road. So you always want to balance things and have kind of a blend of some backloaded, some front-loaded. But I think it would be smart this offseason to have a couple deals where you make it easier to get out of it in a couple years down the road.
One of the phrases you mentioned at the beginning there, I wanted to hone in on it. The Bears have to spend a certain amount of cash this year, which is different than spending a certain amount of cap, C-A-P, this year. I know that it's sort of like a minimum amount of like dollars actually handed out this year, which is different than minimum number of like percentage of the salary cap that they have to spend this year. Could you sort of explain that concept and how much do the Bears actually need to spend?
Yeah, so there is a minimum cash spending requirement that's usually over a number of years, and the current trench of years is 2021 to 2023. Where in the CBA, you have to spend at least 90% of the cumulative salary caps over those 3 years in cash, right? So you use the cap number to give you the number to hit, but it's about cash spending. And so the Bears were the lowest cash spender in the NFL this past season by a pretty significant margin, right? With a $208 million cap cap. They spent about $145 million, so dramatically below that number. So they need to spend in total, including the guys already on their roster, about $245 million in 2023 cash to make sure they hit that minimum. For folks that are wondering, if you don't hit that minimum, you literally just split up that amount over your entire roster. Like and no one ever wants to do that. We haven't seen it. We probably will never see it. So right now we have the Bears about $116 million in cash spending. They need to add 125, or so million dollars to that number, which is a lot of money to spend this offseason.
Yeah. So to be clear, like the reason the Bears were so low in cash spending last year was because you had like the dead money from Khalil Mack was counting as salary cap space, but not cash that they physically handed out on a contract. And now they're kind of in the reverse spot now where it's like they need to hand out more cash than salary cap space through like signing bonuses and like roster bonus up front to where, the player physically takes more money into their bank account, but the salary cap hit on that money is then spread out across the years of the contract. Is that the right way to clarify that?
Right. Yeah, this year they were, I think second to the Atlanta Falcons in dead cap, over $70 million in dead cap, but none of that was cash. It was all prorated bonuses that had already been paid that were just pushed into the future. So, yeah, they still could. A signing bonus in this year, let's say, for an extension, all that cash would still be earned in 2023. So you could spread the cap hits out, but you're still paying all that cash up front. And I think that will be something we'll see is they're not going to be heavily backloading some of these deals. Again, you don't want to go crazy and give a guy all his money the first year and then he has no incentive to really, push hard in the later years of the deal. But I think to a degree, we will see some of that.
Does that make it harder then to try and hold on to some of this extra cap space in the future years? I feel like we saw like the Jaguars last year. I think they had a bunch of cap space and didn't even spend it all that year because they just had so much of it and they got enough cash spent. But like, is it hard for a team like the Bears that need to spend more cash than cap to preserve some of this cap space and go into next year with, I mean, I know they'll gain more next year too, but to not spend as close to the full 94 over the course of the offseason?
I think you can manage it and you can have a decent rollover number. If you spent, let's say you still have 25 million going into the season, obviously, all of that would carry over into 2024, depending how the season goes and maybe some in-season extensions, things like that. But realistically right now, their cap situation is, the books are clean. They can really make sure they manage the next couple of years. But yeah, obviously to a degree, it's going to eat into it, but they have just no, big contracts on the roster right now. They had no big contracts coming into this year and then traded away Roquan Smith and Robert Quinn. So yeah, they have a ton of flexibility from a cash and cap standpoint over the next couple of years.
This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. Because new customers are getting a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app because it's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And just because the regular season and the playoffs are over for the NFL doesn't mean the football betting has to stop. They have XFL odds on FanDuel, NFL draft odds, and looking ahead to next season as well, plus the midpoint of the NBA season across all major sports. It's all there with our friends at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets right back to you free when you go to FanDuel.com/locked on. You can't lose. Just go to FanDuel.com/locked on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA and NFL. We're talking with Brad Spielberger from PFF and overthecap.com about this Bears salary cap situation. And Brad, it's kind of felt like a foregone conclusion that, the likes of Cole Kmet, Darnell Mooney, and Jaylon Johnson are going to get contract extensions this offseason as like one of those ways just to, spend some cash this year without even necessarily drastically increasing this year's salary cap space. Do you think, are we being too presumptuous there? Or do you think this is a real bona fide strategy of here's how we can spend some cash and let's just find some guys on the roster that we do like and give them contract extensions now as opposed to waiting until later?
I think you will see an extension for Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney this offseason. I would be kind of surprised with Jaylon Johnson just because, the injuries over the course of the season, kind of the injuries over the course of his career. And I think he does view himself, and honestly, a lot of players, Cooper Kupp, obviously this quote Bears fans always throw out there, but he has a ton of respect around the league as one of the best corners when he's playing. And I think it would be hard this offseason for the team and him to find a contract that he's happy with and the team's also comfortable giving out based on the season he's coming off of. Whereas, with Mooney, obviously he missed some time as well, but I think he's proven himself. And then Cole Kmet, they've made him Mr. Bear and kind of the face of the franchise in some ways. So those two guys, I would be surprised if they do not sign extensions this offseason.
Is that the kind of thing where we should expect, there's different ways you can navigate a contract extension as far as exactly where you put the money and what year and when it starts. But should we expect if Kmet and Mooney specifically, and maybe Johnson, get a contract extension, do they need to budget additional cap space right now in 2023 for first year stuff to have some of the cash go there? Or is it mostly do they need to get through whatever they do this offseason to leave some extra money right now for those guys? Or will that mostly be applied towards future years?
So yeah, you can approach it either way. Generally, you can make it so that you barely increase the current year cap hit. Going into the fourth year of a rookie deal, you can keep it relatively flat if you want to. I think instead they'll raise it a bit, but still not a dramatic amount. Let's say they're both facing $3.5 million cap hits off the top of my head. Going into next season, you just bump that up to 6, 7, 8 if you want to. You could keep it super low. You could also raise it a significant amount. And I think to a degree with those guys they view as foundational pieces for the next several years. You probably do, to a degree, want to get it over with, right? And like I said, it's again a situation where, down the road, if you wanted to move on from any player, there's not this big, dead money, dead cap, sunk cost, and you feel more comfortable doing that. So, I think those are maybe even more so than the free agents. Maybe you want to front load those guys that you know who they are, you feel comfortable with that, how they fit in your system and your team and your building. All those things, I think it would make a lot of sense.
I want to get into some specific or more specific ranges for each guy in a little bit. But first, from a math standpoint, if you're going to add, say, a 3-year contract extension to either Kmet and Mooney, the numbers don't really matter that much to me here, but I just want to get to the concept that if you're adding 3 more years to the deal, let's say, I'm just going to pick a number, $45 million. It's not important which player or what that means, but if you're going to add a 3-year, $45 million contract extension to Cole Kmet, which seems too high, but that's not the point. If you take that $45 million and add some of it to the current year, 2023, and then add 3 years beyond that, you can take some of the value and add it to the first year while still having the 3 years, then not be 15 per year, but would reduce the amount in the next 3 years, but it would still be a 3-year extension because you're adding 3 years, but the $45 million could be spread over 4 years, the current year plus the next 3 years. Is that how that's handled?
Exactly right. Yeah. So it's, we always talk about new money over new years, but you can put some of that money. Obviously, the signing bonus will go into that first year by just the rules, but you also, in theory, could bump up the salary. Typically, we see a lowered salary, and then the signing bonus increases because you're adding that new signing bonus to the first year. But yes, exactly. So there won't be $45 million in cash or cap allocated to just the 3 new years. You can couch some of it into that original year.
when it comes to these negotiations with these Bears players, we've heard, at least, Jaylon Johnson has said there's been some talk between his agent and the team, and there's an understanding that maybe Mooney and Kmet are involved in some of those discussions now. Do you think we should expect, when the Bears have all the salary cap space already, that they could get those deals done now this spring, or should we expect kind of the more typical timeline of probably summer and fall? Like they'll handle all of the free agent and draft stuff first, get that all squared away, and then circle back to the guys already on the roster later on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, they certainly could. We saw it with Eddie Jackson, a very quick extension right after his year was over with. Typically, you do the free agent players and then your internal guys and the early extensions happens in July, August time. That is kind of the league wide, not just the Bears. That's generally the trend. But yeah, I mean, we've seen them go a different direction in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I think you'll probably see those drag on a little bit. Look, there's no rush there. Obviously, the player's under contract, so I think that's why these negotiations are a battle. Both sides start way too far from where they're actually going to meet up in the middle, and they work their way towards a fair deal for both parties. So it'd be interesting. Maybe they do go that route, but I would guess those come around training camp.
Given that likely is something that would have to wait, do you think they have to? Does it, not that they have to change much, but do you think they have to budget for that a little bit in how they approach free agency this year, in terms of, leaving some amount of space in the back of their minds, even to just say okay, we're going to end up probably increasing Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney's cap hits this year by X amount combined, and understand that we shouldn't spend that in free agency so we can have that flexibility to do that in the future? Or is that, are the books so clean that they don't have to really worry about that?
You do, especially because there aren't a ton of cuts or restructures that clear a ton of money at this point. I'm not sure you want to restructure anyone on the roster. And then, the cuts, they could make some more. Obviously, Al-Qadim Muhammad, the first player to get cut. There are other small moves like that. I mean, he cleared about $3.5 million, but that was one of the bigger, cap clearing moves they had available. So to a degree, yeah, you want to say, hey, we might increase these guys' numbers a bit down the road. We want to have, at least $10 million in season. I think they probably want more than that to roll over. But for IR moves and maybe even mid-season extensions, like for me, I think Jaylon or maybe even Chase Claypool, if they're extended before next offseason, it still I think would be during the year, if at all. Just because I think you need to see more from them and get them healthy and all those things. But you do. Everything is always, interrelated, and they're always budgeting both from a cash and cap standpoint. Especially cash with everything going on with the Bears, both football and otherwise. You have everything, is all connected.
Let's get into some of the more specifics now. I'm not here to say here's the exact projected contract for these Bears players, but I kind of want to get a sense of starting point and range. I think for Cole Kmet, from everything I look around and see, everyone uses that Dawson Knox contract as kind of a comparison point. I think Knox from the Bills got 4 years, $52 million a year, about 13 per year. Is it safe to assume that's the kind of starting point-ish range we look at for a guy like Cole Kmet with similar production, or do you see it going a different direction?
I think it's exactly where you start, and I think it ends up somewhere between him and David Njoku, who got about 13.7. So right in that range, is where I think it will ultimately land. I know Bears fans kind of balk at some of these numbers, and I get it. Look, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that I'm the biggest Cole Kmet fan in the world. I do, over the course of the last couple of years, have kind of realized he's a high floor player, he's a solid player. I think he's pretty good at a lot of things, not really great at anything. He's never going to be some guy that separates against man coverage and is, making guys miss in the open field. But look, he's become a bit more of a red zone threat. He's pretty sure-handed. He's a fine blocker. He's clear, like I said, clearly they care about him as a person and an ambassador for the team a ton, which does matter to a degree. So yes, long answer short, I think that is the range. We'll see that one land.
Do you think tight ends of his style are that valuable? The tight end market seems weird to me that there's just not that big of a gap between the highest paid tight end right now in terms of per year average, at least, is Darren Waller at 17. I know that other guys have gotten more guaranteed money, and there's different ways to value how big is the biggest contract, but that $17 million a year for him compared to 13 for a guy like Cole Kmet, it feels well, wait a minute, why would I pay 13 for Kmet when I can pay 17 for Waller? Not that Waller becomes available. Are we at a point here where other tight end contracts are going to start rising a bit more to kind of meet that perceived value that guys like Waller and Kelsey and Kittle, I know they're on the older side now, at least a couple of those guys aren't going to get the big money, but it just feels like there should be a difference in value in the big time difference making pass catching tight ends and the guys like Kmet that are just good, but not great. And there seems to be like a market inefficiency there where the really valuable tight ends aren't getting paid like drastically more valuable financially than the other tight ends.
110%. It is the bizarrest market, maybe in all of the position groups. I mean, realistically, I would even still argue that George Kittle's $15 million per year is actually the top of the market because Waller's is kind of, it's artificially inflated in years he's probably not going to see. Yeah, no, it's bizarre. And you get all these guys coming up. I think in hindsight, Mark Andrews and Dallas Goedert kind of did a disservice to the position. Not saying their agents, like they're both rep by great agencies and got good deals within the market construct. But yeah, it is the gap between the top guys and the second tier guys is almost non-existent. And it's, unfortunately it is the franchise tag at tight end is a big risk, both because it's a small number and secondly, because this is one of the shortest shelf life positions in the entire NFL, right? We talk about running back a ton and all those things. Tight ends aren't really playing past 30 years old either. And Robert Gronkowski retired at 29 the first time around and then came back. Like we forget about those things. So, and then lastly, Gronk did it the first time. I now think Kittle and Kelsey are doing it again, where it's hard for Goddard and Andrews, like I mentioned, to argue, hey, we should get more than those guys. At the time when they were negotiating their deal, it probably was hard. But the big one for me is TJ Hawkinson needs to get like a legitimate Darren Waller type deal, like an actual 16, 17 million per year deal on a true, early year cash flow, strong guarantees, all of that. But yeah, it's just been it's a position that the teams have just been able to push back on because of short shelf life and the franchise. I mean, the franchise was $10 million last year, closer to 11, but nevertheless, it's an easy tag to place for a lot of these guys.
Yeah, it's a weird market at tight end, and we saw last year it was a weird market at wide receiver with a guy like Christian Kirk getting a deal that everyone was kind of surprised about, and people think maybe set the market too high. But then, other like big name wide receivers like, Hill and Devontae Adams and stuff get traded and get big contracts. So that brings us to Darnell Mooney, where it's kind of I don't know. I've seen people say like Christian Kirk is kind of a starting point there, like or maybe a range there with him and like Deontay Johnson stuff around that $18 million a year range. But like, I remember, like, I'm old enough to remember when those were Allen Robinson numbers that we were talking about a couple of years ago. And now here we are with Darnell Mooney. It's like that 18 to 20 range. Like, is that really where we are right now with a receiver like Mooney, who's very good, but like 18 to 20 used to be like, that's the top number one receiver type money. And now that's number two receiver money.
Yeah, that is where we are. That is the world we're living in, which I know it seems crazy, but you had 10 players signed for 20 million plus per year last offseason alone. So, and of course, it's going to keep going up. We're going to see, maybe T. Higgins. I don't really think so, but maybe he gets another deal and joins that club. More and more receivers. You could see a new deal for Mike Evans, a new deal for DeAndre Hopkins. We can go down the list of guys that are also going to continue to push that number even higher and raise that number one money. Justin Jefferson potentially gets a new deal, which could be, the first true $30 million per year wide receiver. Realistically, probably more like 27, 28. I know Tyreek Hill's listed at 30. It's basically 25, but nevertheless, that is Mooney's number. And you look, you talk about Christian Kirk at 18 per year, had never had 1,000-yard season up to that point, kind of confined to the slot, or at least, the teams view him that way. And got his deal. Yes, it's Jacksonville. But got his deal and honestly, I think played up to it last year already. So
yes, it's Jacksonville, but the Bears have the same kind of money this year that Jacksonville had last year. So they're in a very similar position. I want to wrap up real quick with Jaylon Johnson. And I know this one's kind of the real hard one, and part of why you kind of said like seems less likely to get done at this stage. But I don't know, do you have a sense of like sort of that's like the floor and the ceiling here of like, Jaylon might see himself closer to the ceiling, and based on him being injured a little bit this past year, that the Bears might be towards the floor. Like, are we looking more like I was trying to piece around here, like Carlton Davis, Byron Jones, and that like that JC Jackson $15 to $16 million range? Like, is that closer to the floor side that we're looking at, or was Jaylon Johnson be pushing more like the $19 to $20 million range as these numbers go up with Jari Alexander's big extension and Denzel Ward and stuff? Or I don't know. Do you have a sense of like maybe where you might see him on either side of the spectrum of cornerbacks?
Team would be comfortable with a Carlton Davis type deal, right? Right around 15, maybe even argue kind of Travarius Ward at 13.5. Kind of, there's a bunch of players in that range over the last couple of years. Adoree Jackson's, a bunch of guys in that area. And I think that is probably where the team views it. I think Jaylon Johnson probably thinks he's more in the, Tre'Davious White, 17.25, Xavier Howard, 18 million per year. Like, I think that is the disconnect there by about $3-4 million. And I'm just not sure they find a middle ground just because, the injuries last year, but honestly, coming out of college already, that was a concern. And I'm just not super confident they get something done. Maybe they do, maybe I'm wrong. But it seems like a tough bridge to gap.
And he's not a guy that you necessarily hear them rave about in the exact same ways that they rave about Mooney and Kmet. Like they don't talk bad about Jaylon Johnson, but yeah, when they talk about players on the team, he's not usually like one of the first guys they go to praise the same way for Kmet and Mooney. But Brad Spielberger is one of the first guys I always go to praise about salary cap information, just Chicago Bears and beyond. Brad, really appreciate you joining us today. Let everybody know where they can find your work and some of the stuff you're working on this offseason.
That was a great segue. So yeah, thanks for having me. You can follow me on Twitter at PFF_Brad. And of course, all my work coming out of PFF.com at the top 100 free agents list with contract projections for every single guy. A lot of future Bears on there. So go check that out.
Definitely. Can't recommend it enough. Can't recommend following Brad enough on Twitter. And Brad, I'm sure we'll be in touch at some point this offseason, maybe try and get you back on. But this is like kind of your busy season right now. So appreciate you making the time.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks again to Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus and OverTheCap.com for joining us on the podcast today. If you enjoyed our conversation, make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts and on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel so you can keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thank you for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. On the Locked On Podcast Network, we're your team every day, and that includes all of your sports teams. So check out all of our other Locked On Podcast Network shows for all of your other teams. Chicago sports, we've got Bulls, Cubs, White Sox, Blackhawks, and a couple of colleges as well, Illinois and Northwestern, plus all the other cities across the country. The major sports and college teams are covered here across the Locked On Podcast Network. So go check out those coming back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity to bear down.